The gavel cracked like a fault line, and the room stopped breathing as the verdict landed. The clerk read words that felt carved from ice, and the gallery folded into a hush. Elena Ward steadied her hands on the bench and counted heartbeats. Marcus Hale watched her, and he said, "Look at me, keep breathing." Vivian Cross did not blink, and the polished rail reflected her stillness. Jonah Brooks checked the aisle, mapping exits as if danger moved with the air. A reporter whispered into a mic and lights flared like heat. The judge stared forward, and duty felt heavier than stone. Riley Quinn waited beyond the doors with a message that burned. Elena said, "This feels wrong," and the phrase hovered like dust. Somewhere down the corridor, a phone began to ring. Night pressed against the courthouse steps as the crowd spilled into chill air. Elena Ward felt the verdict chasing her shadow down the stone. Marcus Hale said, "You are not alone," and the words were steady as handrails. Jonah Brooks walked beside them, and his silence drew maps of threats. A siren wailed far off, and the wind carried it like a warning. Vivian Cross paused under the arch and watched without blinking. Riley Quinn stood by a column and gripped a phone that would not stop lighting. Elena said, "Something is missing," and the sentence tasted metallic. Marcus tilted his head as if listening to a second world. The bronze statue above them seemed to lean, as if justice had weight and no balance. The corridor smelled of paper and lemon as Elena Ward searched for any sign of a chain of custody. She traced labels with a fingertip and counted boxes like candles. Marcus Hale said, "We will find what they hid," and the phrase landed like a pledge. Riley Quinn hovered at the threshold and pretended not to listen. "Oh." Jonah Brooks held the door with one shoulder and kept the hallway in view. A flicker on the fluorescent tube skipped like a nervous eye. Elena whispered, "I remember ink on my hands and a tag," and her breath cooled the room. The clerk's logbook sat open and empty where names should be. Somewhere a cart squeaked and then stopped. Riley Quinn stepped forward at last and set a folded sketch on the table. She said, "I saw who carried a box that did not belong." And her voice cut through the hum. Elena Ward felt the room tilt as a path appeared. Marcus Hale asked, "When and where?" and his pen hovered like a compass. Riley pointed at the stairwell, drawn in charcoal, and the mark of a ring. Jonah Brooks looked from the door to the paper and weighed risk like coins. The clock ticked in hard clicks that matched Elena's pulse. The sketch smelled like graphite and rain. Elena said, "Show me," and turned toward the stairs. The office was small and too clean, and the desk held nothing but a letter opener. Elena Ward searched drawer by drawer and found only air. Marcus Hale said, "People erase more than they hide," and he tapped the wood. Riley Quinn listened to the hall and drew a tiny map in the margin of her sketch. Jonah Brooks checked the window latch and the vent grill. Vivian Cross appeared in the doorway and smiled like a sealed envelope. Elena said, "I have one like that at home," and memory bent the room. The silence grew thick as velvet and tasted of old glue. A faint scent of cologne clung to the handles. The light buzzed once and steadied. The cafe hummed with soft chatter and clinking cups, but Elena Ward felt a chill wrap around her spine, as if the verdict had followed her. Marcus Hale leaned forward and said, "You cannot let fear eat you alive," his tone steady as stone. A steaming mug rested untouched between her hands, while the warm comforter, Lydia Moore, sat opposite, her calm smile concealing currents that ran too deep. Jonah Brooks occupied a booth in the corner, his gaze fixed on the street. Riley Quinn sketched quietly, shadows bending her lines into questions. Vivian Cross passed by the window, her reflection blending with neon, watching like glass eyes. Elena whispered, "Every missing page is a stolen heartbeat," and Lydia reached across, fingertips brushing hers with warmth. The lights above flickered, and silence clung to their table like a verdict waiting to be read. Lydia Moore's voice lowered to a whisper, smoothing edges that felt too sharp. She said, "People trust paper more than memory, but memory bleeds, and her words floated like honeyed poison. Elena Ward pressed her palms flat against the table, feeling each grain of wood. Marcus Hale studied Lydia's face, his jaw tight, as though measuring truth against deception. Riley Quinn shifted uneasily, pencil scratching faster, as though her hand knew a secret before her mouth did. Jonah Brooks stirred from the booth, his eyes narrowing at the door. A shadow passed outside, long and sharp under the rainlight. Vivian Cross paused, umbrella tilted, and smiled into the glass. Elena murmured, "There is something she is not telling me," but the comforter's touch lingered like velvet over steel. Riley Quinn snapped her sketchbook shut, her voice sharp enough to cut silence. She said, "You are not hearing it. Someone moved that box," and her eyes sparked with defiance. Elena Ward turned quickly, her pulse racing as if truth had slipped just ahead of her. Marcus Hale said, "Show us then," but his tone carried weight, not encouragement. Lydia Moore's smile faltered, her fingers retreating into her lap. Jonah Brooks adjusted his jacket, ready to follow any lead. A bus hissed outside, tires scattering water like whispers. Vivian Cross vanished from the glass as if she had never stood there. Riley tapped her sketch with urgency and repeated, "I know what I saw." The room seemed smaller, walls leaning in, and time held its breath. Jonah Brooks stepped to the door, pulling it open with a firm hand, and the night air rushed in wet and cold. He said, "We cannot sit still, not with shadows watching," his voice calm but edged. Elena Ward followed, her breath fogging as the rain hit her face. Marcus Hale stayed close, his gaze tracing every passing figure. Riley Quinn tugged her hood tighter, clutching the sketchbook like a shield. Lydia Moore lingered at the threshold, her calm cracked with hesitation, her eyes darting back toward the warm interior. Vivian Cross stood across the street, umbrella lowered, expression unreadable under dim streetlight. The rain thickened, soaking coats and pooling in the cracks of the pavement. Elena whispered, "It feels like the evidence is walking ahead of us," and Jonah nodded once. The melody slipped through the rain like a ghost, just a few notes hummed low, but it froze Elena Ward where she stood. She remembered nights long buried, and the sound carried the weight of someone lost. Riley Quinn whispered, "Do you hear it?" and her eyes widened. Marcus Hale tightened his jaw, refusing to turn, as though the sound alone might break him. Jonah Brooks scanned rooftops, seeking a source in the dark. Lydia Moore closed her eyes briefly, her lips parted as though she knew the tune too well. Across the street, Vivian Cross's expression shifted into something fleeting, a trace of recognition quickly buried. Elena whispered, "It's them," her voice cracking on the syllables. The hum faded into the storm, leaving silence heavier than the rain. Elena Ward unlocked the evidence cage and felt the air turn thin. Shelves rose like narrow cliffs and labels blinked under harsh light. Marcus Hale said, "We log every move," and his pen hovered. Jonah Brooks watched the corridor and mapped footsteps in his head. Riley Quinn whispered, "Box A17 was here," and her finger traced dust. Lydia Moore stood close and offered a steady breath. Elena found the box and heard her pulse calm. The seal looked new enough to lie. She said, "Photograph it, then open." Marcus nodded and framed the tape edge. The lid lifted, and silence cracked. Foam inserts lay empty like missing teeth. Riley said, "Someone reset the room." Jonah stepped back and said, "Close it and scan prints." Vivian Cross appeared at the doorway and smiled without warmth. Elena felt the floor shift, as if the truth moved beneath her shoes. The witness waited in a windowless room and counted the dots in ceiling tiles. Elena Ward sat opposite and set the recorder down. Marcus Hale said, "State your name for the record," and the question felt heavier than usual. The witness stared at water in a paper cup and shook. Riley Quinn watched from the corner and sketched a hand that would not open. Jonah Brooks leaned on the door and listened to the hallway breathe. Lydia Moore said, "You are safe here," and the phrase moved like balm. The witness said, "I did not see the handoff, and the words sounded rehearsed. Elena felt heat rise behind her eyes. She said, "Yesterday you named a ring with a crest." The witness swallowed and looked at the cup. Vivian Cross stood behind glass and measured every syllable. The recorder's red light blinked like a pulse no one could slow. The hallway stretched long and bright, and every step sounded like judgment. Elena Ward said. They got to the witness and the words scraped. Marcus Hale kept pace and said, "We build another route," though his jaw refused to loosen. Riley Quinn walked ahead and would not look back. Lydia Moore said, "Pressure breaks people," and her tone wrapped itself in silk. Jonah Brooks halted at the stairwell and raised a palm for stillness. Elena felt a tide of anger and fear rise together. She said, "We cannot fracture now," and the sentence hurt. Riley snapped, "Believe me or do not," and the door at the end banged once. Marcus said, "Enough," and the word held. Silence fell like a curtain, and the case knotted tighter. Elena breathed and found the rhythm again. She said, "We move as one or we fall." Vivian Cross invited them into her office where the air smelled of polish and order. She stood behind a desk that reflected like water. Elena Ward said, "A box was emptied and resealed," and set the photo down. Vivian said, "Mistakes happen," and her eyes did not move. Marcus Hale said, "This one had intention," and he tapped the seam in the picture. Lydia Moore admired the tidy shelves and said nothing. Jonah Brooks measured the vents and the camera dome with a glance. Riley Quinn stared at a framed commendation and frowned. Vivian said, "Truth is a draft until signed," and the line landed like glass. Elena felt a memory stir and press against her ribs. She said, "Who signed the transfer?" and waited. The clock clicked once, and then held its breath. The elevator doors closed, and the car hummed like a kept secret. Elena Ward watched floors tick down, and tried to shape a plan from smoke. A slip of paper slid under her shoe, and she bent to take it. Marcus Hale read the scrawl and said, "Loading dock, 15 minutes, come alone," and his face hardened. Riley Quinn said, "That is a trap," and her voice shook. Jonah Brooks said, "We control the angles," and he mapped routes aloud. Lydia Moore touched Elena's sleeve and said, "Do not go without eyes on you." The car stopped, and the doors opened to a cold lobby. Elena said, "We split the approach," and her voice steadied. Outside, rain lifted to mist, and the night felt sharper. Somewhere, a truck gear ground, and time began to race. The archive smelled of mold and dust, and the single bulb hummed like a faint warning. Elena Ward dragged a box forward, its cardboard sagging with years. Marcus Hale said, "Handle with care," and bent to steady the corner. Riley Quinn leaned in close, her breath quick. Lydia Moore whispered, "Not everything left behind is meant to be found," but her hand brushed the edge. Jonah Brooks turned pages of the old logbook, scanning rows of forgotten names. Elena's eyes widened as she uncovered a transfer sheet marked by a family crest. She said, "The witness did not lie," and her voice cracked. Marcus lifted the page into the light and muttered, "This changes everything." Riley gasped. That ring was never theirs, and the truth bent the room. The bulb flickered, and shadows seemed to crawl closer, as if secrets resisted being freed. The sealed letter trembled in Elena Ward's hands, as though alive. She said, "I kept this for years," and the paper whispered against her fingers. Marcus Hale's eyes locked on hers, and he said, "You never opened it." Riley Quinn leaned closer, her face tight with urgency. Jonah Brooks said, "If it ties to the crest, it is not coincidence," his voice steady. Lydia Moore shifted, her gaze flickering like someone who already knew. Elena pressed her thumb to the wax and heard it crack. The folded sheet slid free and revealed names she feared to see. Marcus whispered, "This was never supposed to surface," and the air chilled. Riley said, "It means you were marked long before," and her words stung. Elena dropped the paper to the desk, her pulse uneven as the silence turned heavier than stone. Lydia Moore's warmth melted like wax as her smile broke. She said, You think kindness comes free, and her tone sharpened into steel. Elena Ward recoiled, her hands cold. Marcus Hale said, "You knew more than you ever shared," and his voice carried heat. Riley Quinn clenched her fists, her sketchbook pressed to her chest. Jonah Brooks straightened, his weight shifting like a guard bracing for trouble. Lydia leaned forward and said, "I kept you safe, in ways you will never admit." And her eyes glistened. Elena whispered, "You were never sanctuary, you were the price," and her throat closed. Silence rang sharp as a bell. Riley muttered, "We trusted you," and the words tore at the air. The room bent inward with betrayal, the weight of hidden threads snapping one by one. Jonah Brooks stood alone in the corridor, his phone buzzing with messages he ignored. Elena Ward caught his eye and said, "Your silence is louder than truth." He exhaled slowly, shoulders heavy with something unspoken. Marcus Hale pressed, "You traded loyalty once. Will you do it again?" His words direct as a blade. Riley Quinn whispered, "You were watching both doors," suspicion raw in her tone. Lydia Moore turned away, her betrayal still bleeding through the room. Jonah finally said, "I did what had to be done then, and maybe I will again," and the line cracked the air. Elena said, "That is not loyalty, that is surrender," her voice shaking. The corridor lights flickered, elongating their shadows. The case trembled under shifting trust, each step closer to collapse. The gallery echoed with betrayal as Vivian Cross entered with silence like a crown. Elena Ward said, "You were behind the seal," her voice trembling. Vivian smiled, still as glass, and replied, "Control is truth rewritten." Marcus Hale slammed his hand on the table and said, "You twist law into chains." Riley Quinn stepped forward, her voice breaking. "You haunted them with lies." Lydia Moore bowed her head, words lost in shadow. Jonah Brooks said nothing, his silence heavy with revelation. Vivian said, "Justice is not found, it is shaped," her eyes unflinching. Elena whispered, "You are the shadow we could never name," and her hands shook. The chamber walls seemed to bend, filled with echoes. The betrayal settled like a blade pressed cold against skin, reshaping everything they thought they knew. The courtroom brimmed with silence as the trial resumed, every breath caught in the throat of the gallery. Elena Ward placed the sealed evidence envelope on the desk with trembling hands. Marcus Hale leaned forward and said, "We break the chain today." Riley Quinn whispered from the gallery, "Do it now before they bury it again." Jonah Brooks stood by the aisle, his eyes cutting across every corner for movement. Lydia Moore shifted, her calm mask cracked by unease. Vivian Cross rose from her seat, voice smooth, "This is inadmissible, a fabrication." Elena's heart pounded, her voice steady. "This is what was stolen from justice." The judge lifted a brow, gavel resting idle, as the tension thickened. Marcus said, "The truth has been missing too long," his tone sharp as a blade. Vivian smiled without blinking, her presence heavier than the walls themselves. The document unfolded like a wound, its ink glistening under courtroom lamps. Elena Ward read aloud, her voice sharp with every word. Marcus Hale said, "This was never logged," and his tone drew gasps from the gallery. Vivian Cross interjected, "Forgery," her hands slicing the air. Riley Quinn bolted upright, sketchbook clutched, and shouted, "I saw that seal on the night it vanished." Jonah Brooks said nothing, his silence shaping weight. Lydia Moore said softly, "It was always theirs, just hidden," and her eyes lowered. The judge hammered once, demanding order, but the air refused to settle. Elena's breath shook as she said, "This proves a chain broken by design." Marcus slammed the table with his palm. "The evidence speaks louder than denial." Vivian's calm expression cracked into a thin line of fury as the gallery erupted. Vivian Cross leaned forward, her eyes unblinking as she said, "You mistake fragments for truth." Elena Ward felt her chest tighten, rage and fear colliding. Marcus Hale countered, "You built chains of silence, not law," his tone blazing. Riley Quinn shouted. "You cannot erase what we saw," her voice trembling but sharp. Lydia Moore said. She reshaped the story from the beginning, her confession dropping like a stone. Jonah Brooks scanned the gallery, tension sparking in his posture. Vivian said calmly, "Justice is mine to script," and her words struck like a hammer. Elena whispered, "Not anymore," and lifted the evidence higher. The judge's gavel cracked, but the sound drowned beneath rising voices. The chamber bent under pressure, every truth clawing its way to light. The courtroom trembled with emotion as Elena Ward's voice cracked mid-sentence. She said, "I lived with silence, thinking it was survival," and her eyes blurred with tears. Marcus Hale placed a hand on her shoulder saying, "You are not carrying this alone." Riley Quinn whispered, "It was always meant to find you," her words soft but piercing. Lydia Moore covered her face, her mask gone, sobs slipping through fingers. Jonah Brooks stood rigid, torn between action and paralysis. Vivian Cross said, "Weakness has no place here," her tone sharp as broken glass. Elena wiped her tears and said, "Strength is in truth, not silence." The judge leaned forward, gravity etched into his expression. The air thickened, the moment a precipice between justice lost and justice seized. Silence fell sharp after the judge struck his gavel twice, the sound echoing like thunder. Elena Ward's chest rose and fell, every heartbeat counting the cost. Marcus Hale said, "We nearly had it, but it slipped," his jaw tight. Riley Quinn muttered, "They stole it again," fury shaking her voice. Jonah Brooks whispered, "Not all is gone, only delayed," but his words lacked conviction. Lydia Moore raised her head, her face streaked, and said, "Justice twisted is justice denied." Vivian Cross smirked, her gaze unbroken, as though she had won another round. Elena said, "The truth is not lost, only waiting," her voice trembling yet resolute. The gallery stirred, a restless tide of disbelief. The night outside pressed against the windows, heavy with a justice that refused to settle. The gavel's echo died, and left a vacuum that pressed on every chest. Elena Ward sat frozen, her hands trembling as the verdict burned into silence. Marcus Hale said, "It was close, too close," his tone a hushed confession. Riley Quinn leaned forward, whispering, "They stole it in plain sight." Jonah Brooks lingered by the exit, scanning shadows like enemies hiding in light. Lydia Moore lowered her gaze, her face pale from the weight of guilt. Vivian Cross stood tall, her stillness louder than triumph, lips curving in quiet satisfaction. Elena whispered, "Justice slipped through our hands," her words bitter. Marcus touched her arm gently and said, "The fight isn't over." The gallery shifted uneasily, restless as waves against stone. Outside thunder rolled, as if the sky itself judged. The cafe's warmth felt like an illusion as Elena Ward stirred a cup she would not drink. Lydia Moore sat across from her, speaking softly. "You are not alone. I am here." Elena stared at the steam and whispered, "Every comfort feels like a leash." Marcus Hale said, "Trust is earned, not given," his voice cutting through. Riley Quinn pressed her sketchbook to the table and muttered, "She knew too much." Jonah Brooks leaned against the counter, scanning faces outside. Lydia smiled gently, though her eyes betrayed secrets. Elena said, "Even kindness has a cost," and silence draped the booth. Outside, rain blurred the neon lights, a reminder that clarity was always fleeting. The corridor hummed with silence as Jonah Brooks stood rigid, back to the wall. Elena Ward approached, her eyes sharp. She said, "You have held too much back." Jonah exhaled and muttered, "I once traded truth for survival." Marcus Hale stepped closer, fists at his side, and said, "If you break again, we all fall." Riley Quinn glared and whispered, "You watched the wrong door when they moved the box." Lydia Moore turned her face away, shadows clinging to her expression. Jonah said, "I did what was asked," his voice low and heavy. Elena whispered, "You chose silence over loyalty," her tone cutting. The corridor light flickered, throwing their shadows long, and trust thinned to threads ready to snap. The haunting tune drifted again, soft as memory, and Elena Ward froze in the stairwell. She whispered, "It's them," her voice breaking. Riley Quinn clutched the railing, wide-eyed. Marcus Hale steadied himself and said, "A ghost is no witness." Jonah Brooks searched the empty steps above, unease sharp in his face. Lydia Moore whispered, "The memory lives because truth was buried," her tone heavy. Vivian Cross lingered in shadow near the landing, her presence a silhouette against the glow. Elena said, "The past keeps calling us back," and her hand shook against the wall. The hum faded, leaving only silence that pressed like a weight no one could lift. The courtroom felt colder when the verdict settled like dust. Elena Ward said, "We saw justice, then watched it warp," her voice raw. Marcus Hale replied, "It was not denied, only twisted," his tone grim. Riley Quinn muttered, "Twisted is still broken," her anger heavy. Jonah Brooks stood silent, his posture guilt-ridden. Lydia Moore lifted her eyes, voice shaking, "Justice denied is still a wound." Vivian Cross spoke last, her voice calm as glass, "Justice is not lost, it is rewritten." Elena whispered, "Not rewritten, stolen," and her words lingered. The judge's gavel closed the moment, final but hollow. Outside, storm clouds throbbed with lightning, a sky echoing the fracture inside. The rain-slicked streets glistened under dim lamps as Elena Ward faced Vivian Cross at the courthouse steps. Vivian said, "You will never undo what I built," her voice like cold iron. Elena steadied herself and whispered, "Your power ends where truth begins." Marcus Hale stood at her side, shoulders rigid, eyes never leaving Vivian. Jonah Brooks lingered close, tension carved into his stance. Riley Quinn pressed forward, sketchbook clutched like armor. Lydia Moore stood behind, gaze heavy with regret. Thunder rolled above, echoing the fracture between them. The silence between Elena and Vivian pulsed heavier than words, the moment a final collision of shadow and resolve. The courthouse emptied into silence, and Riley Quinn turned away, her footsteps echoing. She muttered, "It will never be over," her voice quivering with fury and loss. Marcus Hale called out, "You do not have to carry this alone," but Riley did not look back. Elena Ward whispered, "She's only 16, yet she carries the fire we fear." Jonah Brooks said, "Sometimes fire burns bridges, sometimes it lights the way." Lydia Moore closed her eyes, hearing the rain hush against glass. Riley pushed into the darkness of the street, the sketchbook hugged tight. Her outline blurred by rain, she vanished into shadow, leaving the others frozen in her absence. The gallery emptied, leaving only silence and scars. Lydia Moore stood apart, her voice breaking. "I gave too much away for comfort's illusion." Elena Ward whispered, "And you took more than you admitted." Marcus Hale said, "Every kindness was a bargain," his tone sharp. Riley Quinn's absence hung heavy, her seat cold and unfilled. Jonah Brooks leaned against the wall, expression unreadable, guilt etched into the lines of his face. Vivian Cross had left her shadow imprinted in every corner. Lydia's tears slipped unchecked, her hands trembling in surrender. Elena looked away and said, "Betrayal leaves echoes, even when the betrayer remains." Silence sealed the air, heavy as a verdict no one wanted to speak. The haunting memory returned in fragments. A melody hummed, a face flickered in Elena Ward's mind. She whispered, "It was never an accident," and her hand gripped the railing. Marcus Hale asked, "Do you mean they chose to vanish?" his voice brittle. Jonah Brooks shifted uneasily, eyes scanning the dark corridor. Riley Quinn's sketchbook left behind held a drawing of the missing figure. Lydia Moore muttered, "The past does not stay buried," her tone weighted with dread. Vivian Cross's absence echoed louder than her presence. The truth cracked open. The lingering memory was not gone but twisted into their fates. Elena's breath shook as she whispered, "They never left us. They were taken." The silence afterward was unbearable, a ghost settling into the room. The final chamber stood hollow, echoes pressing against stone. Vivian Cross words still lingered. "Justice is rewritten. a blade in memory. Elena Ward said softly, "No, justice is missing," her voice carrying into silence. Marcus Hale stood behind, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion. Riley Quinn's absence ached like a wound that would never close. Jonah Brooks whispered, "What we lost may never return," his eyes shadowed. Lydia Moore muttered, "What remains is fractured," her voice low. Elena lifted her head, eyes burning, and whispered, "But truth waits, even in silence." The chamber dimmed into darkness, leaving a single haunting line echoing. Justice was missing, and perhaps always would be.